This talk comes from, I have a position at the China University of Geosciences in Beijing, and I spend a month a year teaching them magnetotellurics. And they've come a long way in the 20 years I've known the Chinese. They do everything really well now. The one thing they don't do is write. And so my wife is an English language teacher. And so my wife offered to give them a scientific writing course. And as part of that writing course, my wife asked me to present a course on scientific publishing. So this talk is really focused on publishing for Chinese students, but it's got some. It clearly is quite generic in a lot of other aspects. So why publish? Why do we do this at all? And clearly, why you're publishing is you want to tell the world, and the world is either, your discipline world, which might be people in your own field, or your geographic local world, people in Southern Africa, or the geophysics world in my case, or perhaps the geochemical world, or the broader geoscience world, or even the general public of the results of your research. And it's quite simply the fact that if you don't publish, you might as well have not done the research, because nobody knows about it. Right? And then I think you have an obligation. If you're funded by public money, you have a responsibility and even also a moral and ethical obligation to publish the results of your work so that others can build on it. Isaac Newton said, "If I have seen further than others, it's because I've stood on their shoulders." And this is what you're doing when you're publishing. You're adding to the body of knowledge. Publishing advances your career. If you don't publish, you don't have an academic career. It's as simple as that. So if you want an academic career, learn to enjoy writing. Even if you want a strong industry career, you've got to learn to write technical reports. Well, that's something quite different from what I'm talking about now. In my view, I think when you're writing a paper for publication, you're calling on skills that are very different from the technical skills that are involved in acquiring data, manipulating data, coming up with a model to explain the data. It's calling on a broader set of skills. And to my view, this is what differentiates a scientist from those with strong technical skills. You have to publish. So what you've got to do is you've got to, even though you might hate it at the beginning, you've got to learn to care about it and even to enjoy it. Because you shouldn't think of it as a necessary evil. It's going to be part of your life. And this is something that all of us make the mistake of doing, and that is we leave publishing till the very end, and we give it low priority. I believe you should be spending at least 10% of your research time, so that's half a day a week, in the act of publishing or getting ready to publish. You don't do it at the last minute when you've got everything. When you've been out and collected an experiment, you're processing the data, you can already be spending a bit of time writing the experimental part on it. And the point of publishing, why you do it, is not to publish for the sake of publishing, but to publish because there's a formal archive of your research. And what you want to have from your publishing, you want to have impact, you want to have influence. You want to basically modify the behaviour of others. If you publish a paper and there's no citations to it, you've not modified anything. You want your body of knowledge to be added, your knowledge to be added to the body of knowledge, and thereby modify the research behaviour of others. I just said that's a waste of time to publish and not have impact or influence. The one thing that we do squander as scientists, we often squander our research time. And when you think about it, you often think, well, that piece of equipment costs X and that software program costs Y. The most important and precious resource you have is your time, because it's in very limited supply. So you've got to harbour that. Every time you're spending time on Facebook is wasted time, or every time you're on your phone is wasted time. You've only got so much time in your life, so much creative time. You might think, well, bloody hell, I'm awake 16 hours a day, but you're not creative 16 hours a day. And if you're wasting your creativity on Facebook, you're not spending it on research. Okay, so publishing is a game. There's no question it's a game. You've got to learn to play the rules, and you've got to learn to play the rules against each other sometimes. And let me just show you, this is, I actually got this not from the geosciences, but from another field, but it's still generically true. The major reasons for ejections. We have 28% is poor research, 21% is poor content, 24% is poor manuscript development, 12% is poor English, 15% is poor journal selection. So only 1/4 of the reasons for rejection have anything to do with your research. All the rest is to do with writing a bad manuscript, presenting a bad manuscript. So on the assumption that you've got quality research that you're trying to publish, you can let yourself down because you're doing one of these things. It is a publishing game. You're going to go through some of your peers, and the point of peer review is basically to when you get to the end game and you get it published, people know that it's been through a process so that others have evaluated it. The grey literature, which is the unrefereed literature, you have to take with a grain of salt because it's not been through this process of peer review. Right? So the peer review process is it can be nasty, you can get angry, you can get annoyed, but whatever you do, don't do any of those things. Look upon these people, even though you might think they're going to batter the heck out of you, look upon them as your friends because they're going to help you. Even the most critical review, if you take out the subjectivity, focus on the objectivity and see how you can improve your manuscript. In science, the credit goes not to the man, and I'm sorry this guy said man, should have said, change that to person. Not to the man who convinces the world, the credit goes to the man who convinces the world, not to the man for whom the idea occurs first. And what this means is that you might have a brilliant idea, but unless you have that idea in a global context, somebody else will, and they will get the credit. So you go out, you're a structural geologist, you go out and you find a particular sequence in South Africa, and you write it up in South African Journal of Geology. Somebody else who happens to glance through it picks that up and realises that has huge global context. So they interpret their data with your view, and they publish their paper in Nature. Who's going to get all the citations? So remember this, right? If you've got a brilliant idea, you've got to work hard to make sure you publish in a journal at that level. And no tectonic process is unique to your country. So if you're discussing any sort of tectonic process, put it in a global context, because that will do one of two things. First of all, it will elevate your journal away from being a more local journal, and the second thing is it will attract more readers and therefore possibly attract more impact, more citations, and thereby more impact. So always be thinking in a global context about what your results might mean. This is an editor of a biosciences journal, but his comments are equally appropriate for geosciences. The following problems appear much too frequently. Submission of papers which are clearly out of scope of the journal. Failure to format the paper according to the guide for authors. This is unbelievable that anybody does it. Inappropriate or no suggested reviewers. Inadequate response to reviewers. Inadequate standard English. And resubmission of rejected manuscripts without revision. It's occurred to me too many times that I get a paper to review, it's a poor paper, I write back to the editor saying this paper needs a lot more work, and I detail the work, And then, damn me, a month later I get the same paper from a different journal to review, almost without alteration. And that time I really come down hard, and if you do that sort of thing, you get a reputation. And your reputation goes before you. The one thing you have, or you have to have as a scientist, is integrity. If your integrity is in question, nobody will believe anything you say, so you've got to have very high integrity. Let me just briefly tell you who I am. Some of you may not know me, so why am I stood here telling you what I know about scientific publishing? The first thing is I've been involved on one side, on the editorial side, for a number of years now. I've had 3 terms as Associate Editor of JGR Solid Earth, 2 terms as Associate Editor of Geology. I was the International Editor of Earth, Planets and Space. I've been the theme editor of a special issue of GQ. I'm the Electrical Methods Editor of Surveys and Geophysics. And I've been a special editor for lots. And on the review side, I review generally 2 to 3 papers a month. And I've been doing this for 40 years. So I've seen about 1,000 papers. Right, so I do, on that side, I know the editorial and reviewing side. On the publishing side, this is my own publication record. The first paper in 1977, I've published 183 papers so far. And these are the journals that I've mostly published in: Geophysical Journal International, JGR, Canadian Journal of Sciences, Pape, Geophysics, GRL, Lithos, Geology. I've published kind of around, and I'll explain why shortly. In terms of citations, I've got almost 10,000 citations, an H-index of 50 and a I-10, that means the number of papers with more than 10 citations of 148. So I'm writing a lot of papers, and they're being fairly well cited. My top papers, these are my top 10 papers, and you can go to Google Scholar and you can see this. The first 4 are about the impact of my work in Tibet. Now, a couple of years ago, my colleague Juan Carlos Afonso, and I talked about some of his work last night in terms of the lit-mod inversion, he developed the inverse code, and I was working with him, and I said, we should apply this to Ireland. And he said, Alan, no one gives a shit about Ireland. And he says, we have to apply it to places where people really care about. South Africa, Tibet, and Western US. You can do the same intellectual work in Ireland as you can in South Africa. It's just that many more people will read your paper if you publish about Tibet. So you can see that the work I've done in Tibet is 4 of the 10 papers, a couple on methodologies, and then some reviews. So my best published papers are impact of my science in an area of global interest, methodology development papers, and review papers. Now, I'm a magnetotelluric guy, and I presented this for magnetotelluric people, so I did a search on the number of papers published in magnetotelluric. You might like to do it in your own game, because it might be useful. So do a search on Web of Science, and in the word magnetotelluric, you'll find there's 3,500 papers published, 44,000 citations, 15,000 articles. So that means we've got average citations per paper of 12.8. In the geosciences, the average citations per paper is 9.5. So our particular game is doing slightly better. And this shows the papers published in magnetotellurics, the fact that we're increasing over the years, and the citations. The magnetotellurics is having a lot more impact outside MT than it did before. So we're getting, on average, 330 citations per year now. And these are the people who publish in magnetotellurics. I'm the top 120 papers. Laus Pedersen, Yasuogawa. And it may be useful in your game to do this statistical exercise. Look who the top players are, but particularly where you want to look is where the papers are published. And in fact, in my game, in magnetotellurics, the top journal is Geophysics, Society of Exploration Geophysics Journal. And the second journal is Geophysical Journal International. So a lot of the methodology papers are appearing in Geophysical Journal International. And then we have the Chinese journal Geophysics, Chinese edition. 156 papers published in it. I'll get on, I'll talk about that in a minute. And then Pape, tectonic physics. So in your game, you do this statistical analysis, look where most of the papers are published in your field, and then maybe try and target those because other people in your field will be looking in that journal. Right? In terms of the number of papers published in my game, magnetotellurics, China is second, with 400 of the papers compared to the US is top, 650, and then Canada 360, and I'm in Canada, or have been in Canada for a long time. But where, of the 408 papers, 40% of them are written in Chinese. So they're going to have no impact outside China. Right, so when you look at the citations to papers, you find that China is down at 6. It's second in terms of publishing, but 6 in terms of citation. And this is because, Chinese geoscience, for the most part, is at global level. So what's the problem? The problem is the accessibility of Chinese geoscience to non-Chinese scientists. And you could say here the accessibility of African geoscience to non-African scientists. And they publish in Chinese, well, you're publishing in English, doesn't matter. Publish in non-mainstream Western journals, or publish in a mainstream Western journal, but the paper is less accessible. It's not quite understandable. There's the problem with the science of the language than the Western papers. Publish in a mainstream journal, but not setting it in a global context. So these are the top papers in magnetotellurics, and it's useful to do this because when you break those down, you see that the top 10 most cited papers, most of them are on methodology development. So people like methodology development. If you come up with a new method of analysing, they jump all over it because it gives them the tool to look at their own. And then a review paper, and then this Tibet paper. And so, if you want to have a lot of impact, and it may be, you could write a review, but most of you are too junior for that. Publish a new idea, and publish a spectacular result in an area of global interest. And you're very lucky here in South Africa because everyone's interested in the Cat-Ball crater. Right, so the strategy now, step 0. This is before publishing. Do the work. And by that, I mean, make sure about 90% of it is done before you start writing. There'll be some iterations you write. Do every single step. Don't do a shortcut on something because that will be a glaring hole in the paper. Do every single step. The survey design, the acquisition, the processing, the analysis, the modelling, the inversion, the interpretation to the very, very best quality you can. I've seen too often young students come to me, they dash out into the field, they come back with rather poor quality data and they think they can fix it in the computer. Well, they can't. Make sure you've got really good quality data to start with, and then really good modern leading edge processing, analysis, modelling, inversion tools, and a very modern interpretation. Because any failing in any one of these will be glaring when you write the workup. And that will seriously hamper your publication process. You're selling a complete package. You're not selling your model, you're selling the whole string that came before it. So step 1, make sure you have a story. Have you done anything of likely interest to anyone else? Who the hell wants to know what you've done? Will anyone care about what you've done? Are you adding to the body of knowledge? So you've got to ask yourself these. Then once you've answered yes to these, what is your story and who is your intended audience? Is it a new method? Is it a new or novel result or interpretation? Is it multidisciplinary? Is it to report on an experiment, a lab experiment or a field experiment? Because the answer to these questions dictates the likely journal you should aim for. The third step, choose your journal. Now here, this is a very personal view, and Sue might have a very different view, but I think there's 4 levels. The top ranked, I would say, because they have highest impact: nature, geoscience, and science. And those are big asks. You're going really high if you aim for those. But don't be frightened of going for those if you've got the science to do it. And then the next rank, I would put a lot of the AGU journals, JGR, GRL, Geophysical Journal International, EPSL, G-Cubed and such. Third ranked, I'd put Pape, Tectonic Physics, Terra Nova, Gondwana Research and such. And then the fourth ranked is what I'd call the local national journals, like my own Canadian Journal of Earth Science or Journal Asian Earth Sciences. Because these tend to be only read by people. Only Canadians read Canadian Journal of Earth Science. Only Asians read that, unless they've been pointed to it for another reason. Right? And the quality of your manuscript has to match at least the quality of the journal. You can't have a quality in mind that you submit to Journal of African Earth Sciences and submit that paper to Nature or Nature Geoscience. Each of those, as you go up this ranking, the quality ask increases hugely. Right? So pick the journal depending on your intended audience. And remember, you're in a competition for time. Not only is time your most precious resource, it's everybody else's. And you want people to spend their precious time on your paper. So you've got to make your paper attractive, and you've got to convince people to come to it. You can do this by choosing a journal, but you also do it by the way you report the research. So you've got to remember these impact factors. Everybody knows about impact factor, but there's another one that's coming out recently, the eigenfactor scores. Have you heard of eigenfactor scores? No, this is something that's been appearing in the last few years. And the eigenfactor score is intended to measure the importance of a journal to the scientific community by considering the origin of the incoming citations. And it's thought to reflect how frequently an average researcher would access content from that journal. And what this means is, let's say you publish in Geophysical Journal, GRL, Geophysical Research Letters. People might routinely go there. Or geology. The journal of geology. I often go to geology because I love geology. I was on the editorial board for 8 years. But I love geology because the 4-page manuscripts, sort of little sound bites if you like, and you can read the journal. You can easily read 50%, 70% of the journal. And so I often go there and just look through it. Electronically, not So I used to love going to the library. Wednesday morning was my library day. I always spent the morning in the library. But these days, I guess you sit on your computer. So, make time for looking through the journals. And so the eigenfactor score is trying to measure how many people usually go to geology, and therefore how many people might serendipitously come across your article. So it's a very different score from impact factor, which is simply average number of citations per paper. So aim for the most appropriate journal for your intended audience with the highest impact factor or eigenfactor score. The mean eigenfactor in geoscience journals is 1.6. And the average citation rate is 9.5. And the reason for that is that it's a very long tail distribution. When you've got Nature Geoscience with 32 citations per paper, and you've got other journals with 1 or less, it's a chi-squared distribution, so it's very long tail. That's why the average is 9.5. The cited half-life is 8.5 years in the geosciences, which is very different from physics, which has got half-life of just a couple of years. And what this means is you'll get half your citations within 8 years. Now, this is a long time, and that's because the geosciences deals with subjects that take some time to be recognised what the impact of the work is, or that experiments might not be repeated for a long time. I mean, the Southern African seismic experiment won't be repeated for a long time, so people have to go back to those papers and those data, and so you have long publication rates. And they say, like a geological map, I'm told by my colleagues in the Geological Survey of Canada, that a geological map has got a half-life of 40 years until they go back and remap it. If speed is important, if you've got a really exciting thing you want to get out, then choose a speedy journal. G-Cubed, EPSL, GRL and Geology are all promote themselves as being fast from beginning to end. So here's the impact factor. Nature and Science, of course, have got very high impact factors. 30 and 35, 34 for Nature. Nature Geoscience, impact factor almost 12. And then reviews and so on. And then these blue ones, GRL, EPSL, JGR, 4.2, 4.1, 3.4. So just look at that ordering. That tells you the average number of citations per paper. And you might say, well, I really want to go for Nature Geoscience because the average citation per paper is 12. Here's the top journals, and why am I showing that again? Ignore that. Oh yeah, top journals in magnetotellurics, and when you look at the papers in magnetotellurics, number of publications per journal against impact factor per journal, you find there's an awful lot of MTE work, magnetotelluric work, that's been published in low impact journals. And you think, why the hell are people doing it? So now let's look at the eigenfactor score. Taking you back to the impact factor score, Nature Science, Nature Geoscience, and then the ones in blue. The eigenfactor score is very different. People are more likely to look through JGR serendipitously than they are to look through Nature Geoscience. So this reverses the order somewhat from what we saw by the impact. Okay, we're still choosing the most appropriate journal, and this again is my personal view. If you've got a methodology paper, in my field, it might be different. In your field, you want to aim for a methodology journal, which in my case is Geophysical Journal International. If you've got an academic approach, geophysics for an applied approach, or computers and geosciences if you want to publish code. If you've got a special, spectacular novel result, then you aim for Nature, Geoscience or Science. If you've got high quality result and interpretation, you aim for JGR, GRL, GQ. If you've got a multidisciplinary interpretation, you might like, I love G-Cubed. The editor of G-Cubed, Torsten Becker, is one of the best editors I know by far. Editor-in-chief. He's a fabulous guy. I don't know when he sleeps, and he's got a young child as well, which is unbelievable. You get emails from him at 4 in the morning. He works really hard. Lithos has been good to me. Geology's been very good. EPSL, tectonics. If you've got an experimental report of global interest, then you could aim for Pape, tectonic physics. And one of local interest, CGS, or as I was giving this in China, the Chinese Journal of Earth Sciences. And what I mean by experimental report is basically just saying, I went there, I did this, and here's what I found. Right? Rather than I went there, I did this, here's what I found, and the impact of that is such and such. And then you might like to aim if you've got some thematic work, like if you've got geothermics, you might aim for Journal of Volcanology, or applied geophysics, you go to geophysics, geophysical prospecting, or physics, pure and applied geophysics. So then also we talked about the size. Think about the size. If you go in short format, you go to one of these short format journals. Medium size, EPSL, full paper, JGR, and GQ. Just remember though, short format doesn't mean less work. Mark Twain is famous for writing a long letter to a friend, and at the end of it he said, please forgive the long letter, I didn't have time to write a short one. And what this means is it's much, much harder to encapsulate an idea in a short sentence than it is in a paragraph. Right? And if you're writing in a short format journal, you have got to be very compact in the way you put your paper together. You can't use flowing language, you've got to be very clinical. So it's a lot tougher to get into these short format journals. Don't go cheap when choosing a journal. What I mean by don't go cheap is that you've done a lot of work. You've been out, collected data, you've analysed it, you've researched it, you've spent a year or a year and a half of your life You owe it to yourself to aim as high as you can. Don't think because lower journals might have a lower quality standard that you'll do that. Because you'll pay for it in the end. You'll have less chance of your paper having impact. So aim as high as you can. I just said that. Avoid conference publications. You often have conferences like IGC. I was a convener of a session at the IGC, and as always, whenever I do this, I get 2 or 3 invitations from journals to have a special issue, and I always avoid them because nobody reads conference publications. You know, they tend to be slow. They're at the speed of the slowest common author, the slowest author, and they tend not to be read by the general geoscience community. Different though for thematic issues, like I was the theme editor of a lithosphere seems to be boundary theme. And they can have higher profile than normal, and so can result in greater exposure. Once you've chosen your journal, next thing to do is download instructions to authors. This is before you even start writing. Download instructions to authors. You've got to follow those instructions to the letter, precisely. Any variance from those instructions to authors, and your editor has a chance to say no, and fling it back at you without even sending it out for review. Right? You don't want that to happen. You want the editor to be on your side, not against you, at all stages through this. Right? Now you're writing the text. Right? You've chosen your journal, you've downloaded it, you've read it, you understood what the journal's looking for. Right? You're writing the text. The first thing to do, write in bullet form exactly how you're going to outline your paper. And then, don't write any more text, construct the figures. The figures are far more important. A figure is worth 1,000 words. Construct the figures and the tables, and also the figure captions. Don't start at the beginning and write linearly to the end. Leave the introduction, conclusions, and especially the abstract to the last. They're the most important of all. And they're the first read by anyone thinking of investing their time in your paper. So, especially the abstract conclusions, they demand the most focused time and attention of you, and you need to know by that point how you've constructed the paper. So, think of a creative and attractive title. We have in my field these things called induction vectors, which is a relationship between the vertical and horizontal magnetic field. And the first man to point this out was called W. Parkinson in 1959-1960, and they've been called Parkinson's pointers. You can use them as an arrow, as a vector. And I published a paper that showed that sometimes they can point the wrong way. They're not pointing at conductors, they're pointing away. And so the paper is called Parkinson's pointers perfidy. Perfidy, the word perfidy, it means lies. Parkinson's pointers lies. And I got the paper accepted, and the editor says, I've accepted your paper, but you have to change the title. So I did. Next time I saw him, he was really mad as hell. So now start writing. This is a really important one, and that is all of the journals these days use some plagiarizing checking software. Authenticate or Turnitin. All of them. And they will put your submission through that, and if they notice too many coincidences of phrases or half sentences, your paper's bounced right out. Your paper has to be you. It can't be somebody else, right? It has to be you. So don't plagiarize. It takes work. You've read a phrase, and particularly like I do, I'm an electromagnetic geophysicist, but I step out of my field a little bit. I look into petrology and I read a phrase. I think, wow! And then I've got to stumble about how to rephrase it in my words. But you have to do this. So you've got the figures constructed, so now write the introduction, conclusions, and finally the abstract. And then the figure captions. Make sure you can spend time with the figure captions. Check the spelling, the grammar, the sentence structure, the citations, the references. Check it all. Then check it again. Then check it a third time. And then check it until you're sick of checking it, and check it twice more. Because you'll be amazed just how how many papers I see where the authors have not really read their final submission. You know, bad sentences, verbs missing, and my God, they haven't put the time for this. You don't want to give the reviewers any cause to become frustrated with your paper, frustrated or annoyed at any of the non-science issues. You want them to focus on the science. So you don't want them to focus on the language or the way you've constructed the figures or the maps. You want them to focus on the science that you're presenting. And this is basically the process. You're building up your paper, starting with your figures, the methods, results, discussion, conclusion, introduction, expert, and abstract. And this is called the INRAD format. Introduction, what question was studied? Methods, how was the problem studied? Results, what are the findings, and discussion. What do these findings mean? And this point differentiates you in terms of the type of journal you can aim for. You can write, you can write all of this, and then depending on that, you're either Nature or you're the African Journal of Geology. Depending on the impact of what you found. And this is where most of the work is, the intellectual work. When you go out and, in my case, dig holes and lay down instruments, it's physical work, it's not very intellectual work. You have to remember what you're doing. But the intellectual work is here, and this is where the research and the science is in. Right? So an abstract, tell your readers what you did. An abstract is generally 50 to 300 words. And it's basically an advertisement. A lot of people glance through the abstracts, right? Because you can go on many services like Web of Science and you can see the abstract and you can decide, do I want to download that paper? Do I want to really read that paper? So a clear abstract will strongly influence if your work is considered further. For review, in going out to reviewers, or if accepted, for reading by those people who are very short on time. So here's a typical abstract. First paragraph says what's been done, the second paragraph says what was found. The introduction now, the introduction has got to start at the large scale and come down to the scale of what you've done. So you answer a series of questions in the introduction. What's the problem? Are there any existing solutions? Which one is the best and most current? What's its main limitation? What do you hope to achieve? And what do you want to convince the readers about? So you're starting very general in the introduction. You don't start and jump right in and said, I found a peridotite with very high olivine content. Or whatever. You start in and saying, generally in the Capocraton, the olivine contents are this because of such and such. And you feed it down into what you want to convince the readers about. One thing I didn't appreciate, my wife pointed out to me as I was writing this lecture, is, and Sue and I were chatting a bit about this, and I didn't have time to look at the African rhetorical style. So there's a big difference between rhetorical styles from different countries, right? And most of the science journals use English rhetorical style, and English rhetorical style is different even from Mediterranean rhetorical style. You've often met an Italian who talk for 20 minutes and then it gets translated into 2 words or so. Hello. It's a very different rhetorical style, the Romance language. And I didn't appreciate that it's very different between the East and the West. I won't go through all this, I'm making this available to you. But in the Western rhetorical style, the responsibility lies entirely on the writer to explain everything, and the reader plays a passive role in Western rhetorical style. In Eastern rhetorical style, the writer lays out the arguments, and it's for the reader to be active and deduce meaning. And so, essentially, in the Western rhetorical style, writers take the primary responsibility for creating meaning. They have to spell out everything for the reader. So the readers are being very passive here. They're having it all laid out. In the Eastern style, the task of the writer is to stimulate the reader into contemplating the issue. And it's an inductive pattern of ideas development. And so you can just see how, particularly when I was talking to the Chinese, it's very difficult for them to publish because even when they're writing in English, they're still thinking in this type of rhetorical style. And from what I read last night about African rhetorical style, I think that differs quite a lot from Western rhetorical style. So you've got to learn to, if you want to publish in US or Canadian or English journals, you've got to learn to write in this style. Okay, now you're doing your interview. You've written your paper, you've got it complete, you think it's the best thing ever written. It's not going to be, let me tell you that. So you give it to somebody for internal review. And this could be a friend, a colleague, and you ask them to be a devil's advocate. You know what a devil's advocate is? This is somebody you ask them to be as hard as you can, because you want to get the hardest review you can get at this stage because it's informal. So you might like to give it to 2 people or 3 people and say, look, give me as tough a review as you can of my paper. Don't get upset when they do. Right? And then it's much better to get tough words from your colleague. They come back to you and say, that's a piece of shit when you wrote that. You've got to explain it this way and that way. It's much better to get that than to get the paper rejected by the journal, or to get words like that, because you've got to remember, you submit something of poor quality into a journal, editors and reviewers have memory. The next time you submit something, they've got this memory about you and your abilities, and that goes against you. It's far easier. This is a thing. My students love LaTeX. I hate LaTeX. I used to work in LaTeX, but the problem with LaTeX is when you're working if you've got co-authors, they don't have this absolutely wonderful track changes and comment feature that Word has. So my students they write in LaTeX, and I get them to give me a Word version. And there's a LaTeX to Word tool. So they always write their manuscript in LaTeX. They send me the manuscript, nice pretty PDF, but then they send me the Word version using this tool, and I go into that tool. And this is a great way, as an internal reviewer, to go in and modify sentences and change things. So you're going to revise after internal review. You're going to go very carefully and address all of your colleagues' criticisms, because they're trying to help you out. And if they say something, you don't go to them and say, well, you're stupid because I didn't mean that. No, that's not right. It's your fault that they didn't get your meaning out of the way you wrote it. Prepare the final text. Prepare the final versions of the figures. I've too often seen figures in publications where you have a figure and you get a big bright red thing over here, and they talk about a spotted little green thing over there, and you think, why are you talking about the red thing? Make sure when you construct your figures that you're emphasizing the points that you want to emphasize. One thing that geophysicists often are at fault of, geologists not at all so, are that they'll submit a paper with some vague map in it, and then they'll talk about localities or geological or geographical localities that they won't be on any map anywhere. So you surely have some trouble. And then make sure your text is legible in your figures. People have got to be able to read everything. Then you compile a final PDF for submission. The next is a really important point. Choose your potential reviewers of your work. You've got to think about who would be good reviewers and also who may not be good reviewers. Suggest strong names. Don't go cheap on the names. Don't think, oh, my mate Bill will give me an easy review. Because the journal, they're not stupid editors, they look through and oh yeah, he works with him, he's published with him. So then they'll give them to Joe, who they know rejects everything he's ever said. So the interesting thing about the Chinese, which I pointed out to them, I don't know how true this is in Africa, but Chinese reviewers are harder on Chinese than non-Chinese reviewers are. And so quite often the Chinese will think, I'll suggest some of my Chinese colleagues in other institutions, but because of the animosity and the competitive between institutions, they often hammer each other down. And people in the West, we don't know this, so we can just focus on the science. So there's a reference to that comment. One thing you might like to do is, we're all human, right? We've all got feelings, and why get a paper to review? I remember there's a guy called Dick Bailey who told me this. University of Toronto, when I was a postdoc there, Dick Bailey is a fabulous theoretician, he's retired now. And I was in the mail room with him, and this is in the early 80s, in the days when you got papers by mail. And I was standing there, and he was ripping open a brown envelope. He'd been sent a paper to review, and he held it, and he went right to the back and started looking. I said, Dick, what are you doing? He says, I'm seeing how many times they refer to my papers. I said, what? He said, yeah. 4 or more references is acceptable, 3 is minor, 2 is major, and 1 or less I reject it. And it was tongue-in-cheek, but at the same time, if you write a paper in which you're referring to somebody's work in a positive way, they might be a good reviewer for you, because they'll think, oh look, this guy thinks of my work in a positive way. If you're doing a multidisciplinary paper, then of course you've got to list, if you're doing EM geophysics but you're relating it to petrology, you've got to list some petrologists, tectonics, and so on. No conflicts of interest. The editors, they're not stupid, and the journals are not stupid. They know about same institution, they know about collaboration. So avoid conflicts of interest, because you get an opportunity to suggest maybe 5 names, and if you suggest 2 that are conflicts of interest, you've lost 2 of your 5 spots. Avoid poor reviewers. Now, poor reviewers are ones that are slow. They might be very good, but they're slow because they're going to slow you down. They do a poor job, or they're naturally very negative. And I know a few of these in my field, and I always ask that the papers don't go to them. And remember that your friends might not be your friends when reviewing your manuscript. So don't necessarily pick your friends. And then every journal has usually got an editorial board, and you can choose an editor. So look through the editors. And I don't want Torsten Becker to suddenly get 50 papers from University of Wits, but he's a wonderful editor. I should have turned it off. Then now, a really important step. You've written your manuscript, you've compiled it, you've chosen your reviewers. The letter to the editor. This is incredibly important. In the letter to the editor, you've got to tell the editor why you think your paper is worthy of publication. I've just done this piece of work and it shows this and this and this, and you can paraphrase from your abstract. Right? You've got to tell him or her whether it's totally new work or whether some's been published elsewhere, and you've got to be totally honest about this, and I'll describe something in a minute. You've got to say, okay, 28% of it was published previously in African Journal of Geology. Also. You've got to also say that all the co-authors have approved submission of this version. They want to see that that's been done. And then you've got to say why you chose his or her journal. I chose your journal because your journal has papers on X, Y, and Z, and it's very fitting that my paper comes into your journal because I've done this sort of work, and I want to tell my story to the readers of your journal. And then you list for him in your letter, as well as doing this online when you're submitting your journal, you list for him the names of your reviewers and explain why you think those reviewers are appropriate. You're trying to bias the editor towards your view. So editors are busy people. You make their life easy by saying, I've chosen this person, I've never worked with this person, he's at this institute and I think he's appropriate because he wrote a paper on X, Y, and Z. I chose this other person, I also haven't worked with that person. So make it easy, make it crystal clear why you've chosen those reviewers. And then you list those who you don't want the paper to go to. And I use a simple phrase, I just say I have a conflict with that person. Then you submit it by the journal's web portal. Never ever submit a poor paper. Don't think to yourself, okay, I don't quite understand it, but let me just put this in now. I'll see what the reviewers say, and maybe they'll give me an idea. Don't be intellectually lazy. Because if you submit a poor paper, poor in the terms of science, English language or all other issues, as I say, the editors and the reviewers, they've got memory, they'll remember this, right? Don't expect the reviewers to do your job for you, as in interpreting the data. I just said this. They've got memory. You'll find it harder to publish other papers. Remember that it's a philosophical thing. A paper represents you. It makes a statement about you as a person, about who you are as a scientist. You want your paper to be the highest possible quality, the highest possible integrity you can achieve. Then you wait. You're waiting for the decision of the editor, first of all, that it will go out. And this happens in Nature Science, Nature Geoscience. First of all, the editor may take a month to decide whether to send it out for review. And then while you're waiting, start your next paper. Now, let's say you sent it to one of these big papers and you've been rejected, right? Very often your submission to Nature Science, Nature Geoscience will be rejected by the editor. It won't even go out for review. Don't be upset by that. A 2006 statistic, I think you had a more recent one, of a Nature paper, 60% didn't go out for review. In a 2012 statistic, 82% of Nature Geoscience papers don't go out for review. So 4 out of 5 papers don't go out for review. So this is the gamble that you're taking when you aim for these biggies, right? Now, is there anything you can do when you get a rejection to challenge an editor's decision? Yes, you can. And the process can be long and frustrating. I think it's dubious whether it's worthwhile, actually. Let me tell you a couple of stories here about 2 papers submitted the same month to Nature Geoscience. One was with my student, now postdoc Florian Pape. It was about the Kunlun Fault, and we had this conceptual idea of melt penetration in the finger-like fashion. And then was by my colleague Zhao Guotze, his work on the Long Lenshan just after the Lenshan earthquake. Wonderful piece of work. Both of them absolutely wonderful pieces of work. Both rejected by Amy Whitchurch, associate editor, who is a climate scientist. Right? Nothing against her, but she rejected these papers. So, with the Lepape paper, this was the comments that she sent back. And let me just tell you the positive here. The good is, we have no doubt that your findings regarding penetrated intrusion northwards from the Tibetan crust will be of inherent interest to fellow specialists. Yes. The bad, but, always a but, say something, but. But we are unable to conclude that the paper would be likely to excite the immediate interest of research in the broad range of geosciences. And I wrote back right away and I told her that this experiment, these magnetotelluric experiments we've been doing on the Tibetan Plateau, we've published 4 papers, 3 in Science, 1 in Nature, and they had very high citation rates. So I was refuting her claim that no one is, in the broad range of geosciences, no one's interested in the results, right? And I sent her that, and she said, okay, I'll think about it. It took her 2 months before she said, okay, in response to your letter, we've decided to send the paper out for review. 2 months. So, really tough reviews came back, and this is what may happen in Nature because it's such concise that it's hard to get everything in, and you put a lot of stuff in supplementary material. Finally accepted in March 2012. It's got 44 citations, which is 4 times the impact factor in Nature Geoscience. So I fought my way in, and I've now got a paper that's got, at the moment, 44 citations. Now the other paper, the Zhao et al., I'm just picking out the bad here. Unfortunately, we do not believe that the manuscript provides a sort of conceptual advice in scientific understanding that would be likely to excite immediate interest of researchers in the broad range. Sounds very similar, right? Same words. In the broad range of other areas, exactly the same. So I composed a similar email and sent it to my colleague Zhao Guotze, and he sent it in to Amy Whitchurch. So then she wrote back over 2 months later, 72 days later, and she had put a bit of work in. And what she realised, and what my colleague Zhao Guotze had never told me, was that he published preliminary findings in 2010 in Geologica Acta. Has anyone heard of Geologica Acta? No. It's the university publication of the University of Barcelona. I'd never heard of it. But somehow, she put the work in to see whether... And Zalgodse had basically not been completely honest because he hadn't said in his letter to the editor that we have this previous publication. And she'd found it, just bam, cut off at the legs, right? We cannot justify its publication. And the lesson to learn here is, don't be cheap on yourself. Don't think you can publish results in short form in some little local journal that no one's going to notice, and then in long form later on. Don't waste your time publishing in low quality journals that can harm you. So eventually we got the paper accepted in geology. It took another 8 months there. I mean, it currently has 48 citations, so over 4 times the impact factor of Nature. It's a shame that it never got into Nature Geoscience, but it's having the same impact. And in this time we lost because, as I would say, they published in a little bit of it in the prior publication. So now you're going to get back your reviews. You've waited and waited, you're going to get your reviews back. And it's almost never accepted. Okay? Accepted subject to minor revision, moderate or major. Now, what's happened these days, since I was your age, when I was your age, you used to get back reviews, major revision. You hardly ever get major revision back because journals want to look efficient, so they want to have a short time between submission and acceptance. Right? So rather than major revision, which they know is going to take you 2 or 3 months to do, they reject your paper and say, we'd be willing to see a revised version. So, ahead of a revised version, taking the comments of the reviewers into account. So basically what they're saying is, yeah, we like your stuff, there's a lot of work to do, and we want to see it back. So that's equivalent really to major. If you get, and I've had from one journal, we reject this paper, we never want to see it again. And then they really reject it. Let me just show you this chart that I got, which is the acceptance probability based on a 2-review process. So if you've got both reviewers saying reject, you're dead, of course. If you've got a major and reject, you're almost dead. A minor and reject, you're 20% dead. Accept and reject, you're still below 50% probability of final acceptance. So if any of your reviewers give you a reject, you're against the odds. You've got less than 50% probability of getting all the way. So you really want to avoid getting a rejection, if you can. Minor, accept is where you want to be. Minor, major. A minor, major is a 75% acceptance rate. So you've really got to put in a quality manuscript so you don't get a reject. Revision. So here's where you go through, and as an editor, I've had to go back to authors when they've submitted me a revised version and say, I'm not accepting this revised version unless you show me on a point-by-point basis and also by using a text comparison what changes you've made. So you've got to go through each and every comment made by the reviewer and the editor and provide a response to each and every one. So what I tend to do is I get the review, I copy and paste it into a Word file and I make that all black, and then I put my response in red under each one. And so an editor, when he picks it up, he can see point 1, reviewers comment, my response. Point 2, reviewers comment, my response. And the response will be some text. I agree with the reviewer and I have changed the manuscript with the following sentence. And then I would quote the change that I made in the manuscript. So you make it very, very easy for the editor to know exactly what you've done and how you responded. You want the editor to know that you respect the reviewer's opinions and you're dealing with them, right? One important thing is you don't have to agree with every comment or suggestion made. If somebody says, I think they shouldn't be using blue for that, I think they should be using red, you write back and say, I respect the suggestion of the reviewer, but I wish to continue to use red because of X, Y, and Z. Right? You tell the editor exactly why, and you give coherent, logical, solid arguments why you're not following through with the reviewer's comments. Think of your reviewer as your friend, even if he isn't. Or at least, the reviewer represents, in some respects, your intended audience. And as I said before, if he writes back, I didn't understand that, you shouldn't be thinking, the guy's a doofus. You should be thinking, I didn't explain it properly. It's your fault, not the reviewer's fault, if they don't understand what you've said. Don't become annoyed or antagonistic. I unfortunately got into a little bit of a battle a few years ago, which I eventually had to capitulate on, where I started getting antagonistic towards the reviewer, and the editor will always take the side of the reviewer. Right? It's a biased playing field. It's not like a football game where you've got 11 people on each side. It's like a football game, except the referee plays for the other side. The reviewer, the process demands that the editor sides with the reviewers, otherwise the whole stack of cards will fall apart. Right? Absolutely demands that because if I send in a solid review and the editor ignores me, I'm never going to review for that journal again. And so they know this, and so they're always going to take your side in an argument. Reviewer's side. Okay, what do you do with competing reviews? One reviewer says, that should be in blue, and the other one says, that should be in red. So what you do is you make your choice. You say, I agree with reviewer B that should be red because of these reasons. You don't ever take a reviewer's criticism over another reviewer because of seniority, nationality or collegiality. You don't think, well, he's an American, so his views count more than this guy from South Africa. Don't ever do that. Everything has to be based on logic and science. Explain very carefully in the response to the editor that there's competing reviews and you've chosen reviewer A over reviewer B because you're submitting the revised version. List all the comments made by the reviewers and your responses, a PDF of the differences between the revised and the original version. This is very easy to do. And a letter to the editor stating exactly what you've done, thanking the editor, wonderful reviews, you worked very hard and I'm really pleased, I'm submitting this heavily revised version and blah blah blah. Okay, now you go back to step 11 of the grade, and you might iterate a couple of times. So here's a flow chart. Submit a paper, basic requirements, notebook. Yes, assign reviewers, review, collect reviewers, make a decision, reject, bump, accept, or revision. So, you're going to go around the circle. Hopefully you never get to this stage. So, 15th step, your manuscript's been accepted. If you want to read more about this, I got some of the material from this particular paper about Chinese authors. And then also, there's this chap from Elsevier who's got a PowerPoint that you can download. So I just want to say one other thing, which I hope I got this right, which is good luck. Oh no, right quality publications. Poor experimentation can be masked by brilliant writing, but poor writing can mask brilliant experimentation. You spend a huge amount of time in the experimentation. You have to justify it to yourself to put as much intellectual effort into the writing. So good luck. Let's say good luck. I got this on Google Translate. All that says good luck. But remember, as Thomas Jefferson said, I'm a great believer in luck, and I find the harder I work, the more I have of it. Thanks very much.